What happens when a man haunted by his past discovers the truth behind his fiancée's arrival? This story will take you on a thrilling ride through revenge, redemption, and an impossible choice. Was buffing his finest footwear when the percussive thrum of war drums reverberated through Cedar Canyon. He ceased all movement, the polishing rag gripped in his fingers, the steady resonant beat caromed off the rocky inclines, a relentless, unceasing tempest of sound. This very day was set for Catherine's long-awaited arrival from Kansas City. He had dwelled in solitude on this homestead for 3 years, meticulously forging an existence in the utterly secluded hollow of Colorado Territory, the closest human habitation lay 15 miles distant, a solitude he cherished. Until this moment the drums conveyed a singular message: the Kiowa raiding contingent, which had been pillaging settlements 50 miles to the south, was advancing northward perilously. Near, uncomfortably close, he moved onto his veranda, his hands calloused by work clamping the timber rail. The waning daylight stretched elongated silhouettes across his property, but an unsettling dissonance pervaded the air, a profound abnormality. His livestock no longer grazed serenely, instead they huddled tightly by the barn, agitated and restless. Even his canine companion Marshall whimpered low, his ears pressed flat against his skull. He retrieved his father's aged telescope from within the dwelling and ascended to the rooftop. The sight, magnified by the optic, sent a chill straight through his veins. Obscure forms traversed the crest of the ridge. He could discern no fewer than a dozen, yet these were no mere scouts, nor a meager raiding band. As he refined the focus, more silhouettes materialized, and still more. They were strategically placed at every egress from the depression. The epiphany struck him with visceral force. This was no fleeting attack. They were not merely traversing 400 combatants, potentially more had entirely enveloped Cedar Canyon. They had transformed his haven into a snare's gullet, parched. As his thoughts turned to Catherine, her conveyance was anticipated before dusk, utilizing the primary route that now passed directly through hostile lands. She was utterly oblivious to the peril she approached, unaware that the man she had consented to wed sight unseen had just become the most perilous individual in the entire Colorado Territory. To be near, he descended from the roof, his thoughts in a frantic whirl. The prudent course of action would be to seize his steed and attempt flight via the constricted watercourse on the eastern flank. Perhaps he could elude them in the deepening gloom, yet that would necessitate forsaking Catherine to whatever destiny awaited her. When her stagecoach entered this lethal hollow, the martial drums intensified, becoming more imperative. They were no longer merely signifying their presence, they were transmitting messages, orchestrating whatever scheme they had devised. It was on the verge of commencement, but what was unaware of was that the chieftain of this war expedition had been observing him for weeks, anticipating this precise juncture, and the advent of his intended was no mere fortuity. His hands trembling, loaded his Winchester, tallying his rounds, 43 cartridges against 400 combatants. The arithmetic was straightforward, yet horrifying. He had encountered tales of the grim fates befalling isolated homesteaders ensnared by such large war groups. Not one of those narratives concluded favorably. His thoughts turned to Catherine's most recent missive, still tucked away in his breast pocket. She had penned words expressing her eagerness to finally encounter him, describing the new gown acquired for their nuptials and her desire for a fresh start in Colorado Territory, a place where her history remained unknown. She had placed her faith in him to safeguard her, to provide the life she had envisioned. Now his mere presence might condemn her to death. The martial drumming ceased. The abrupt stillness proved in a way more unsettling than the preceding clamor. Ears strained for any auditory cue, yet even the breeze appeared to have subsided. His livestock stood utterly motionless, as if collectively holding their breath. This was the deceptive quiet before an impending catastrophe. Then he distinguished it. Hoofbeats, not the anticipated thunderous cavalry charge, but the measured clip-clop of a lone equine drawing near from the southern path. His heart pounded against his sternum, as he grasped the implication someone was advancing directly into the snare. Ignorant of the fighters arrayed along every ridge, peering through his telescope, he discerned the equestrian. A youthful Kiowa brave, yet an anomaly presented itself. The combatant's hands were elevated, and he bore a white fabric affixed to a lengthy pole, a banner of parley. The mount proceeded at a slow, purposeful pace, as if its rider wished to be clearly observed from afar. Thoughts accelerated. In his 3 years inhabiting this valley, he had never experienced direct interaction with any indigenous war parties. He had heard of their occasional practice of taking captives for bargaining, but this felt distinct, more intimate. The young warrior was advancing straight for his dwelling, as if possessing precise knowledge of his whereabouts. The rider halted 50 yards from the veranda, well within effective rifle distance, yet sufficiently far to indicate no immediate hostile intent. He appeared youthful, perhaps 20, with elaborate martial markings adorning half his countenance, but it was the man's gaze that captured attention. They did not burn with the fury he had anticipated. They held an almost complacent quality, as if all was unfolding as predetermined. The young warrior hailed him in heavily accented English. "We need to converse." The revelation that this unknown individual spoke his name sent an icy dread through his limbs. Moved onto his veranda, weapon poised, but not yet directed. "Discuss what?" The combatant's lips curved into what could have been a slight grin. "About the female you anticipate, about our true purpose here." He paused, allowing the words to resonate. "About the decision you will face when her stagecoach arrives in 2 hours. But the warrior's subsequent declaration would dismantle every assumption held about this day. The young warrior's pronouncement struck with the force of a physical impact. "Your intended isn't arriving here by chance," the brave declared. "She is coming because someone precisely informed her of your location and the time of arrival." His hold on the firearm firmed. "What are you articulating?" "Catherine and I have been exchanging correspondence for months. She elected to come here." The combatant slowly shook his head. "Letters can be composed by any hand. The woman you believe you know is not real." He reached into a hide satchel and retrieved a folded document. "This is the genuine Catherine Morrison. She succumbed to fever in Kansas City 3 weeks prior." Complexion paled drastically. The warrior cast the paper onto the earth, separating them. Even from his vantage, could discern it was an authenticated death registry. The female he had intended to wed, the one who had sent him such heartfelt epistles regarding their shared future, was already interred in a Kansas burial ground. "Then who approaches in that stagecoach's voice was a mere breath. "Someone who needs you to accept her as Catherine Morrison, someone valuable enough to mobilize 400 warriors." The young warrior's gaze held a glint that seemed akin to commiseration. "Someone you have encountered previously, though you hold no recollection of her." Thoughts spun. No element seemed coherent. Why would someone undertake such an intricate masquerade? Who could possibly command the encirclement of an entire valley by a war contingent? He delved into his personal history, endeavoring to recall any female who might possess such motive for elaborate deceit. "You fabricate," he asserted, yet his tone conveyed no certainty. Too many fragments were aligning. The correspondence had always appeared excessively flawless, overly comprehending. Catherine had never sought precise information about his land, never inquired why he had selected such a remote locale. She had accepted every detail, without the genuine inquisitiveness a true woman would exhibit. The young warrior proceeded. 3 years ago you were a transformed individual. You resided elsewhere. You engaged in actions that indelibly affected the lives of others. He gestured towards the elevated contours where the other fighters lay in wait. "She enlisted our aid to ensure you cannot flee upon her arrival. She desires to gaze into your eyes when she reveals her true identity." Limbs felt unsteady. There existed a period preceding this valley, before his attempt to assume the mantle of a mere rancher, a time when he had sported a marshal's insignia and cultivated Adversaries, a period when his judgments carried repercussions that pursued individuals even to their final resting places. He had convinced himself that past existence was interred, that 3 years of seclusion constituted sufficient atonement. The rumble of remote wheels pierced his contemplation. A stagecoach ascended the southern path, just discernible through the canyons, opening. The female within believed she was on the cusp of encountering her prospective spouse, yet in truth she was arriving to dispense a justice delayed by 3 years. But the true identity of the woman aboard that carriage would utterly demolish everything believed about his own history. The conveyance rumbled nearer, and discerned the coachman's voice addressing his horses, oblivious to the fact he was transporting his fare directly into the core of a meticulously designed snare. The young warrior observed's countenance with keen focus, as if analyzing every sentiment that flickered across it. "You still have no recollection, do you?" the combatant stated. Marshal of Deadwood Creek, the individual who buried blameless souls because his arrogance prevented him from acknowledging his error. The pronouncement struck with the impact of projectiles. Marshal, a designation he had endeavored to inter alongside the insignia he had cast into a river 3 years prior. Recollections deluged him. The assault on the mercantile station, the kin caught amidst the volley, the small female child who had shrieked as projectiles whizzed by. He had been so certain he was pursuing the correct malefactors, so convinced he was ushering in rectitude to the frontier, but he had been mistaken, terribly mistaken. The Morrison household breathed. The complete terror finally engulfed him. Catherine Morrison was not arriving to become his wife. She was already deceased because of his actions. The young warrior nodded somberly. Her sibling Sarah barely escaped that day. She dedicated 2 years to orchestrating this instant, absorbing every detail about you, tracing your whereabouts after you vanished. He gestured towards the approaching carriage. She penned those letters. She transformed into Catherine in every significant aspect merely to get near enough to confront you directly. His hands quivered as he lowered his firearm. Sarah Morrison, he recalled her now. A girl of 12 concealed behind a capsized conveyance, while her relatives perished on the ground. He had been too preoccupied with pursuing the desperadoes to perceive that his deputies' erratic gunfire had struck blameless individuals. By the moment he comprehended his blunder, 3 members of the Morrison kin were deceased, including young Catherine. The conveyance was now merely a few hundred paces distant. Through his telescope could discern a female's outline in the window. Sarah Morrison, now matured, arriving to exact a recompense cultivated over 3 years. "What is her desire?" inquired, though he already held the answer. "Rectitude, the variety you never bestowed upon her kin." The young warrior's voice was devoid of warmth, yet not devoid of deference. "She could simply have engaged us to terminate you. That would have been more straightforward, but she wished you to comprehend the reason for your demise. She desired you to recall their visages when your end arrived." The grinding sound of wheels on stone intensified. The coachman began to decelerate, spotting the dwelling in the distance. In moments Sarah Morrison would disembark from that carriage and confront the man who had shattered her youth in a barrage of misdirected gunfire. Considered flight, his steed was saddled and prepared in the stable. Yet 400 combatants encircled the valley. More significantly, he knew he merited whatever Sarah had orchestrated for him. He had devoted 3 years to attempting to expunge the events of Deadwood Creek from his memory, but the deceased do not remain interred when the living decline to permit their repose. The conveyance halted before his dwelling. The coachman doffed his hat, proclaiming jovially a consignment for Mr. Your intended is here whole and hearty. Yet what transpired when Sarah Morrison descended from that coach would illustrate that certain hurts never mend and some obligations can only be settled in blood. The stagecoach portal swung open, and a female figure alighted onto the pulverized earth. She bore no resemblance to preconceived notions of Catherine Morrison. This individual was statuesque and slender, with raven hair drawn back severely, and eyes that held the frigid inferno of one who had endured suffering for an extended period. She was clad in an unadorned journeying gown, yet her gait possessed a quality that evoked the image of a predator stalking its quarry. Sarah Morrison bore an uncanny likeness to her progenitor. The similitude was so striking it provoked a pang of culpability in his breast. The same formidable jawline, the identical penetrating cerulean gaze, the very posture that implied an unyielding resolve. The coachman descended to retrieve her luggage, prattling gaily about the agreeable climate and the charming vistas. He remained blissfully ignorant that he had just delivered a woman to her family's slayer, or that 400 warriors observed his every gesture from the circumjacent ridges. Sarah remunerated the driver and dispatched him, her smile failing to reach her eyes. She tarried until the stagecoach vanished around the curve before directly confronting. The metamorphosis was instantaneous and unnerving. The agreeable facade she had presented for the coachman's sake evaporated, supplanted by 3 years of meticulously cultivated animosity. "Greetings, Marshal," she uttered, her voice unwavering and composed. "Or do you prefer? Now, I presume individuals such as yourself discard names as readily as you abandon locales." Placed his firearm against the veranda railing. Pretense was futile now. "Sarah, you have matured. It's astonishing what enduring a slaughter can do to an individual." She advanced, each stride purposeful and deliberate. "I was 12 years of age when you entered our trading post with your deputies, weapons blazing, pursuing phantoms and labeling it righteousness." The young warrior who had conveyed the message remained astride his horse, observing the confrontation with the certitude of one who foresaw the precise outcome. Behind him could discern additional combatants positioning themselves along the canyon's precipices, not menacingly, merely present, ensuring his comprehension that escape was not a possibility. Sarah halted 10 feet from the veranda. "I dedicated 2 years to tracking you after you vanished from Deadwood Creek, 2 years to mastering the art of corresponding as a solitary woman yearning for affection, 2 years perfecting Catherine's inflection, so you would credit every syllable." Why, queried, despite recognizing the folly of the inquiry. "Why not simply have them end my life? Why undertake all of this?" Sarah's laughter was piercing and acrid because a projectile would have been too facile, too swift. "I wished for you to experience hope first, to believe you had discovered contentment, to imagine you had eluded the repercussions of what you did to my family." Her eyes shimmered with unshed moisture. "Restrained for 3 years. I desired you to feel what we felt when your bullets struck us instead of the outlaws you were genuinely pursuing." If you're enjoying this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales from the Old West. Sarah delved into her satchel and withdrew a diminutive timber container. Instantly identified it. It had been the possession of her father, Thomas Morrison. The elder had sculpted it personally and kept his most cherished belongings within its sight. Now, in Sarah's grasp, churned stomach with renewed culpability. "Do you recall your words to me that day?" Sarah inquired, her voice barely constrained after the gunfire ceased. "And you comprehended your deputy's action?" Shut his eyes, the recollection striking him like a physical impact. "I stated I was apologetic, that it was unforeseen, that we were pursuing hazardous individuals, and that such occurrences are endemic to the frontier." Sarah concluded that my family was simply ill-fated in their timing and location, that I should be thankful you apprehended the genuine desperadoes before they could harm anyone else. She unsealed the timber container and glimpsed something shimmering within, not an implement of combat, but something more potent. Corroboration. "Except you never apprehended the authentic outlaws, did you, Marshal? You abandoned the pursuit after what befell us, deemed the matter too convoluted, too intricate, burdened by excessive documentation." The young warrior adjusted in his saddle, his gaze oscillating between Sarah and, as if observing a meticulously orchestrated spectacle. This was not solely about retribution. This transcended into something grander. Sarah extracted a folded paper from the container. "I located them." The Individuals you were truly pursuing that day. It took me 3 years, but I found them. She unfurled the document disclosing wanted notices and affirmed depositions. They are still living, still pillaging, still murdering. Because your shame over your blunder prevented you from completing what you initiated, the pronouncements impacted with greater force than any projectile in his culpability and dread concerning the Morrison family's demise. He had cast aside his insignia and escaped into the untamed lands. He had convinced himself it was atonement, that he was withdrawing from a profession too hazardous for him to execute. But the reality was simpler and more craven. He had abdicated his duties. The Garrett Syndicate has claimed 14 additional lives since Deadwood Creek. Sarah proceeded, her voice gaining intensity with each utterance. 14 individuals who would still be breathing if you had fulfilled your duty instead of fleeing to play at ranching in this hollow. Felt the burden of those fatalities settling upon his shoulders. It was already grievous enough that he had taken blameless lives through his imprudence, but the realization that his pusillanimity had resulted in further deaths, more households shattered, made him feel as if he were submerging in culpability. Sarah presented another document. This is a territorial mandate for the Garrett Syndicate, still in effect, still legitimate. She regarded him with icy resolve. You are going to assist me in concluding what you commenced 3 years past. You are going to aid me in tracking them. And if I decline, inquired, though he already comprehended the response. Sarah indicated the warriors arrayed about the canyon. Then my comrades here will ensure you never depart this valley, but your demise will not resurrect my family, nor will it prevent the Garrett Syndicate from slaying more blameless individuals. She advanced her gaze alight with resolve. I desire justice, authentic justice, not mere vengeance. The young warrior spoke for the first time since Sarah's appearance. The decision is yours. Former Marshal, perish here as a craven or survive long enough to perhaps attain a modicum of atonement. However, Sarah's subsequent disclosure regarding the Garrett Syndicate's newest objective would compel to undertake the most arduous choice of his existence. Sarah extracted one last document from the timber container and observed her hands quivering subtly. For the first time since her appearance, the Garrett Syndicate is no longer merely slaying arbitrary travelers. She explained they have become more structured, more cunning. She presented him a telegram dated only 5 days prior. They intend to attack the children's transport next week. His blood turned to ice as he perused the message. Each month, a unique rail carriage conveyed orphaned youths from congested eastern metropolises to new families in the western domains. 4 to 3 children ranging from 6 to 15 years old would be aboard that conveyance, helpless youngsters seeking new residences and fresh promise. The train pauses in Millfield for replenishment. Sarah proceeded an isolated depot devoid of legal authority for 50 miles in any compass direction. The gang is aware the transport carries a secure chest containing adoption charges and familial disbursements. They are indifferent to the certainty that children will be caught in the exchange of fire. The young warrior nodded somberly. We have been shadowing the Garrett Syndicate for weeks. They now number 30 men, well-equipped and desperate. They have been devising this assault for months. Felt nauseated. More blameless children, just as Sarah had been 3 years past. More families annihilated because he had been too pusillanimous to complete what he had initiated. The recurring motif was unmistakable. His shortcomings consistently proliferated, engendering additional casualties, greater anguish. Why approach me? Inquired. You could present this intelligence to the territorial marshal, the cavalry, any entity possessing genuine authority. Sarah's mirth was acrid. I attempted. They declared the information untrustworthy. Because its origin was tribal, they will not proceed based on the Testimony of Kiowa fighters even when the lives of children are imperiled. She indicated the young warrior running Elk's people have been observing the gang accumulating proof endeavoring to avert this carnage, but Caucasian authorities will not heed them. Running Elk interjected, our offspring have been transported on similar conveyances, absconded from their kin and dispatched to residential academies. We comprehend the anguish when youngsters are severed from those who love them. His voice conveyed profound sorrow. We will not permit more children to perish, because adult males are too arrogant to collaborate. Comprehended the comprehensive scale of Sarah's design. This was not merely about exacting retribution for her family's fatalities. She had forged a pact between her pursuit of rectification and the Kiowa's resolve to shield blameless youths. She had transmuted his culpability into an instrument capable of preserving lives. The train will arrive at Millfield in 4 days, Sarah stated. We can reach it in 3 if we press diligently. You possess greater insight into the Garrett Syndicate's tactics than anyone. You understand their thought processes, their modus operandi. She paused, allowing the gravity of the instant to sink in. You cannot restore my family, but you can rescue those children. The orb of day began to descend, stretching elongated shadows across the valley. Surveyed his cabin, his livestock, the unassuming existence he had constructed to evade his history. All of it abruptly appeared insignificant, contrasted with 43 children who would perish if he opted for ease over valor. But the resolution he was on the brink of making would dictate whether he expired as the craven who fled Deadwood Creek, or as the individual who at last discovered the fortitude to confront his errors, entered his dwelling and re-emerged moments subsequent bearing his marshal's insignia. He had kept it secreted in an aged coffee container, incapable of discarding it entirely. Despite his disgrace, the metallic object felt frigid and ponderous in his palm, burdened with every error he had committed, and every opportunity he had foregone to set things aright. I will assist you, he declared, affixing the emblem to his garment, not because I merit atonement, but because those children merit existence. Sarah inclined her head, and for the inaugural time since her arrival something akin to deference flickered in her gaze. This will not balance our ledger. Nothing can restore my kin, I am aware, he responded. But perhaps we can prevent another family from enduring what yours did. Running Elk dismounted and drew near to both of them. My fighters will accompany us. The Garrett Syndicate has plundered from our nation, slain our young males, confiscated our steeds. This obligation is reciprocal. Within 60 minutes they were prepared to depart, had amassed his armaments, provisions, and his finest steed. Sarah had donned utilitarian riding attire and equipped herself with a rifle that appeared well-used and meticulously cared for. The combatants materialized from their concealed locations around the valley, a disciplined contingent bound by their mutual aspiration to safeguard blameless existences. As they departed Cedar Canyon in unison, understood that Sarah's strategy had been impeccable from its inception. She had not merely wished for his demise, she had intended to compel him to embody the man he ought to have been 3 years prior, the man who completed what he commenced, the man who shielded the blameless instead of absconding from his inadequacies. The coalition was peculiar and delicate. A disfavored former marshal, a young female consumed by the imperative for rectification, and a Kiowa war cohort united in their resolve to rescue children they had never encountered. Yet it was also formidable. They possessed proficiencies the Garrett Syndicate would not foresee, intelligence they could not anticipate, and a drive that penetrated deeper than mere avarice. The journey to Millfield would lead them through perilous terrain, past other habitations that might not greet the sight of armed Kiowa fighters with hospitality, but found himself uncharacteristically optimistic for the first time in 3 years, not because he harbored belief in obtaining absolution, some transgressions were too monumental for that, but because he at last had the opportunity to channel his culpability into something constructive. Sarah rode alongside him in silence for the initial few miles. Then uttered softly, "My father always asserted that virtuous men were not those who never erred, they were the ones who discovered the bravery to rectify their blunders." Irrespective of the personal cost, nodded, comprehending that this was the nearest he would ever come to absolution from her. It would have to suffice 4 days hence, when the children's train drew into Millfield Station. It would encounter not only the Garrett syndicate lying in wait for an ambush, but also a contingent of resolute guardians prepared to guarantee that this time the blameless would not incur the cost of wicked men's avarice. The individual who had once been too timid to confront his shortcomings was finally poised to embody the marshal he should have been from the outset. If you enjoyed this incredible story of redemption and justice, subscribe to our channel for more amazing tales from the American frontier. Now click on this video on your screen to hear another gripping story about a stagecoach driver who discovered his passenger was the most wanted criminal in 3 territories, but she was also the only person who could save his dying daughter. Click now